Raukarangatira mā e hui hui mai nei. E hono mai ai, mā te ipurangi, tēnā koutou. Tēnā tātou katoa e hui tahi nei ki tō tātou whare a te ara a tāpaki. Ki te whakanui i tēnei kaupapa, ara Te Āti Awa, me te mihi kia mahina. Welcome to those online. We appreciate you joining us today. Please add comments in the chat and we'll and ask any questions, and we'll endeavour to have them answered by her speaker after her presentation. Ko Kirsten hapita ahau, no Ngāti Raukawa, no Ngāti Toa, no Te Āti Awa ahau. My name is Kirsten. I am your MC for the day, and it is our pleasure to welcome you here today to the second of our 4 lectures in our lunchtime lecture series, hosted by Te Wānanga Raukawa, Te Whare Oranga, and Te Whare Whakatupu Mātauranga. Our guiding kaupapa for this lunchtime lecture series is kaitiakitanga, with a focus this year on our maramataka Māori. These lectures are being held from 12 to 1 each Friday, with the exception of today, that is, of course, from 1 to 2. Each lecture stands alone, so you don't need to attend all of them. You can join into any one you wish to. So feel free to come to any of the 2 lecture series that are remaining over the next 2 weeks. Please register at wānanga.com so that we know that you are coming and we can keep you up to date with events and stay in touch with you. Before we introduce our speaker, we just have some important tikanga and housekeeping to let you know about. COVID-19, ki te māwiwi koe, tēnā, hono mai mā te ipurangi. If you are unwell, please join by the internet or online. Second thing, we ask that you please scan on the QR codes at the door, and there's also some here at the front, before you leave, anytime during the event. There's also hand sanitizer available throughout the whare. Feel free to wear masks and don't be shy to let people know if you wish to stand apart from others. You're most welcome to do that. In case of an emergency, rui whenua, tsunami, fire, please leave through any of the doors and make your way to the large grassy area to the front and to the north. For the session, please turn off your phone, turn off or mute your phone. And please refrain from eating in this space. You are welcome to bring your water in. One more thing, we're recording this lecture for our purposes and for the benefit of our students. We will release these on the YouTube channel once they've been vetted by the speaker. If you're registered online, you will get a link to those. Therefore, please refrain from recording this lecture on your own device. Actually, one more thing. Please respect the speaker and ask your questions at the end when invited. We will have microphones available and ask that you ask your questions using the microphone so that those online can hear. Actually, another thing, the whare uti on this side of the whare at the rear. We expect to finish today at 2 p.m. Please join us for tea, coffee, snacks afterwards through the store and out in the foyer. No mai, hara mai. So, to the main event for today, I would like to introduce Dr. Mahina-a-rangi Baker, no te kōtahitanga o Ātiawa, Raukawa, Ngāti Toa. He kānohi kitea, he ingoa e rangona I roto I ngā mahi kaitiakitanga. Hara mai I te whananga.
Tēnā tātou katoa, tēnā koe e te whare, ki ngā kaumātua, koe mā, koro mā, tēnei te mihi nunui, mihi aroha, ki te kiti a koutou. Ki ngā whānau, kei te kiti e tehi o ngā whānau no Ahitereiria, kei te mātaki mai to those that are joining us, whether it's in offices around the corner or in different countries across the ocean. Thank you so much for coming to this kōrero today. I wanted to start actually by acknowledging my whanaunga and colleague, Pātaka Moore, who had the idea that we should have a session of kōrero on this kaupapa of māramataka. It's often something that lots of us will try and kind of sneak into a kōrero on something else. And so it's going to be quite indulgent for me to just have the space to talk about māramataka, to talk about the moon, and to nerd out a little bit. So I'm going to assume that if you're listening to this kōrero, you are really interested in the moon and we can really go for it. I wanted to just start by giving a quick overview of what I wanted to cover in this kōrero today. I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about the moon and making sure we all have a similar understanding of who the moon is and what the moon does, to talk about the origins of māramataka, to then talk about, in getting into this kaupapa around Mana Motuhake and the māramataka, Mana Motuhake and the moon, how to develop our own personal māramataka. I want to flit about a little bit in this kōrero and have a think about what the kāwanatanga is doing and how they prescribe we should be managing the environment, for example, and therefore the impacts of that on practices like māramataka, on knowledge systems that inform māramataka. And lastly, I want to talk about the Mana Motuhake of the moon herself and the personhood of the moon and challenges to the sovereignty of the moon. So this image of the moon captured recently, this is the peak of Maunga Taranaki, with a full moon just nestled really beautifully at the top of the moon, at the top of the Maunga there. And I thought I should start by talking about my own personal learnings to do with the moon. For quite a long time, I've been reluctant to speak with any sort of sense of authority on this topic. It's, as I will talk about, in my view, quite a personal knowledge practice. However, I started to learn about the moon when I was a young student on exchange at the University of Hawaii, and I was studying kālo cultivation, the cultivation of taro, and every day our kumu, our teacher, could potentially ask us, what moon is it? And that was whether we could see it and say what it was, or whether we had seen it earlier in the day or the evening before. And that's where I really came to understand and to practice the significance of understanding the moon. On my return home to Aotearoa, I started to work in the Māori organic space and had the privilege of engaging with expert growers around the country. And again, the moon and the māramataka featured really strongly in any kōrero we would have. So I want to acknowledge growers like Ruben Taipari and well-known māramataka practitioners like our whanaunga, Hini Hoterene, and the other various expert growers that shared their knowledge with me. Then I probably started to connect with some of the navigators, and they were really helpful in understanding the moon from another perspective. So I'm thinking of people like Tāwhana Chadwick and Raihania Tipoki, particularly the crew of Te Matua Maui. And as I started to really get into this kaupapa, moon people kind of reveal themselves to you. Liliana Clark would be another. I just want to acknowledge from all the way back to Hawaii, Ed Cashman, Kaliko Spencer, all the conversations with these people about Mahina, the moon. So a little bit of nerding out. We won't do too much of this, but I wanted to look at what the moon does, how we understand these different phases of the moon. And so this video, this image is showing the rotation of the moon around planet Earth. And a really interesting feature of its rotation is that if you watch really carefully, the moon is also rotating on its axis. The moon isn't stationary, rotating the Earth. It is rotating itself. But it's rotating at almost exactly the same rate that it takes to move right around the Earth. And so the result of this is that we actually only ever see one side of the moon. The same face of the moon is facing us as it rotates Earth. And that's because of something I understand that happened about 4 billion years ago, where the moon was tidally locked to us on planet Earth and started to rotate in this fashion. So it's important, I think, to think about the moon as being dynamic. The moon has a bulge that's been created over these billions of years as a consequence of the effects of the Earth and its gravity on the moon. The moon is also slowly moving away from us. It's getting a few centimeters further away from us every year. So the moon isn't static, the moon is dynamic. And when we think about mapping out the activities we do as people, we need to think about that the moon is also changing itself. And so the Mātauranga itself is dynamic. And I know we'll have a speaker who will also talk about the effects of climate change on Mātauranga. So a couple of other key questions about the moon. One of the questions I get is, so when it's this moon day, does the moon, if it's this moon at night, was it that moon during the day preceding, or is it that moon day the day following? And one of the other important things to know about the moon is that it rises and sets at a different time every day. A moon day is a little longer than a sun day. It's much easier to talk about this when we use our reo, because in te reo we would refer to a day as rā, and that's to do with the sun. And in te reo we would refer to these moon days as the marama. What is the marama? So because the moon rises a little later every day, the other thought I just wanted to plant in people's mind is that the moon is not something associated with night. And we started to see this kind of creep into our thinking. Sometimes I hear karakia that reference, you know, the day is finished, the moon is rising, it's nighttime. Actually, the moon is rising at the moment. It will rise just after 3 o'clock today, very soon. And so from a mātauranga perspective, the moon is as much a feature of the day, as much important to think about in the context of the day as it is the night. And we could also talk about, if we were really nerding out, that the movement of the moon is actually far more impacted by the gravity of the sun than it is of the earth. And there is a relationship between sun and moon. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to always observe these rising and setting patterns of the moon by looking at the moon, obviously, but we can't always do that. We can't always see where the moon is in the sky. It could be cloudy. We could be too busy. You can also just look online if you're interested in building your own Mātauranga and check out when the moon rises and sets. Some important things to point out here, and I'm going to use my mouse pointer. Let's see how well I do with this. So may seem obvious, but we need to ensure when we're looking at when the moon rises and sets that we're looking at that for Wellington Aotearoa, or it doesn't yet show Ōtaki. Maybe we could get that into the system. Another thing to be aware of in building Mātauranga, and particularly if we're using paper or I guess even electronic calendars, that have something like a full moon or new moon on the calendar is many of these are made in the United States. And actually the day that it's marking is not the day that it's a full moon or a new moon or a whatever moon in Aotearoa. So we have to be really located where we are wanting to observe the moon. So here is, where are we? Is it the 4th today? Had that roughly right. After 3 o'clock today, the moon will rise, and then it will set early in the morning, and then it will rise the following day a little later, and it will set a little later, and so on. As we move through the different phases of the moon, that period of time is longer. I'm going to come back to why that's very important to understand when we build our own mātauranga. So why, this might be an obvious question, but why do we have mātauranga? What is the origin of mātauranga? I like to think of the origins of mātauranga and our ideas about the moon, and I'll be very informed by that thinking I was exposed to in Hawaii, that moon is companion. Very much in a Hawaiian way of thinking, it's taught as moon is companion to the earth. There's a couple of old texts that speak about the moon is the true companion of women, and that might be something to do with our natural cycles that align with moon cycles. And if we just stop and think about that a little more, I think most people understand that the moon has a big impact on things like tides. So it's so powerful, its gravity is so significant that as it is rotating around the earth and we're moving around the sun, it is pulling the ocean off the surface of the earth. And depending on where the moon is and where the earth is and where the sun is, that will significantly impact the tides. It doesn't just impact the water in the ocean, of course. It impacts water under the ground, so the water table can come right up. Again, referencing the Hawaiian exposure to this I had, there are earth tides, magma and tectonic movement that are associated with the effects of the moon. And that's relevant to us here in Aotearoa as well, to think about the pull that the moon has on the earth itself. So that's water, and I think many people understand that. And then we need to think about that water is in everything. Water is in the food we eat. A grower will be able to tell you the difference in the quality of kumara that was planted at a certain time of the mātauranga because of the water content in that kumara as opposed to another time of the mātauranga. And there is water, a lot of it, in us. So as women, there is the why that is impacted by a moon's monthly cycle, but as human beings, we're affected by that pull as well. And then you think about the impacts of things like the tides on the migration of fish and their life cycle, and so on and so on. We could identify so many different aspects of ecology that are impacted by these moon dynamics. And so it follows then that the moon is so important, also because whilst we can track the change in how we observe the sun throughout a year, with the moon, we can track this change every day. And we can observe sometimes periods that are distinct. On certain parts of the mātauranga, there are very distinct single days that we can observe that are important to observe. So the mātauranga is a map for observing the world, but it's also a map for observing ourselves. And it's therefore a map for observing our relationship and connection to the Taiao. So I'd suggest we can't really apply mātauranga as an observation tool of the world around us without understanding our own internal mātauranga. And I've said here, in thinking about Mana Motuhake, recognizes our own individual distinct rhythm. if I look at the phases of the moon that are just reflected there in the image, and I think about, you know, there's Whiro and there's this new moon period, and people think, well, Whiro's bad, Whiro's not great, Whiro's miscommunication. But I know some people who quite like Whiro, who quite like to just keep to themselves, to reflect, to have an excuse to just stop. The tamatea periods, which could be, for some could be really chaotic, for others could be very creative through all of the energy that's changing. The end of tamatea could be a relief, or it could be something exciting. Coming up to the full moon period, I know many high functioning people that find that incredibly exhausting and have to really do some self-protection. It's not necessarily this wonderfully productive time of completion. It's a time of great stress. And so on with kore kore. It might be nice to start to slow down, or it might be frustrating to have to. And I hope you can see what I'm saying is there is a subjective perspective that we might bring as people to what it actually means. All these patterns that are happening that we're observing mean different things to different people. But we have been so conditioned to think that there should be one calendar, one pattern, one approach to productivity. We work from 9 to 5. We have 5-day work weeks and so on, rather than having the freedom to follow our own rhythms and own patterns of productivity and pause. And this thinking is just so supported by mātauranga Māori and the wisdom that we're lucky to have. I also think Mana Motuhake is really about recognising the legitimacy of subjective knowledge. And so I've referenced here theorising that's in Te Ahu Karamu, Charles Royal's PhD thesis on Te Whare Tāpiri. And I'm going to try and make an attempt to show how this topic weaves in not just with the kaitiakitanga side of things and the kaitiakitanga degrees and teaching that we offer here at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, but how it permeates into lots of different areas of learning. And so this particular theory actually comes from performing arts, from Te Ahu Karamu, where he took writings from Māori Marsden and the Woven Universe, and he expanded on these 3 kete, ngā kete o Te Wānanga, 3 modes of knowledge production. And he said there was te kete tuauri, which is the theoretical real world. But we acknowledge up front as Māori, none of us can ever see it. None of us ever know what the real world is. We can only observe it. And that gives us te kete aronui, a knowledge system that comes from everything we perceive and observe, and very much the home of Mana Motuhake. And we use that theoretical knowledge combined with what we observe, and we use that and we pull that together to make predictions about what we'll see in the future. And hence, te kete tuatia, all the predictive knowledges around tohu or environmental indicators, and again, Mana Motuhake. So Mana Motuhake reminds us that from a Māori perspective, there is no objective truth. There is only our subjective perspective of it. And I think that's important at the moment to think about. Not too long ago, I think Auckland University, considered, you know, pretty highly ranked university for us regionally in Aotearoa, had very powerful lead academics coming out and saying, Māori knowledge isn't as valuable. Māori don't have science. And one of the key bases for that argument was there needs to be the ability to prove something as objectively being true. From an Indigenous perspective, we reject that. So in its own little way, Mana Motuhake is about recognising the importance of that knowledge. And so we're all then contributors to that. I'm thinking now about one of my students was so lovely to share with me her koro's māramataka, written in hand, and then, and I'm going to get this wrong, whether it was her cousin or brother, but an uncle who just over the river had an entirely different māramataka that said different things. And this was on the East Coast. And I thought that was so fantastic because what that was showing, what I saw, were māramataka that had been developed and refined over time, that were relevant to place and were practiced. And I think where some people look at two different māramataka and ask, what one should I follow? My response to that would be, learn from that and then write your own and develop your own. Because reclaiming these types of knowledges, there's more to it than just receiving what is left. We all have a responsibility in the continuation of mātauranga Māori to be knowledge builders ourselves. And so we all need to participate in those observations and building that knowledge if we want our knowledge to survive. And nobody else is going to do that for us. That's on all of us. So I'm going to come back and try and spend not too much time on how you might start to build your own māramataka, remembering this feature of the moon's behaviour, that the length of time for a day of a moon for a marama is a little longer than of a day, of a rā. And what that eventually means is throughout the period of a month, you get to a point where the moon is rising closer and closer to midnight. And let's say, for argument's sake, it was today. It rose just before midnight today. And then it wouldn't rise again tomorrow on the 5th. It would rise on the 6th, just after midnight. And another challenge in observing māramataka, particularly when we're using calendars that depict Gregorian, if I can call it that, calendars that have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd day, is that you cannot map a māramataka directly onto that map, because inevitably there will be one day in the month where there is not a moon to put on. I'm going to break that down because I know this can be confusing. So firstly, I did not think about the fact I would be sharing my personal māramataka when I drafted this up, and so it's very messy, and please don't try and read too much into this with my scribbled terrible handwriting, but I'm going to try and help you to make sense of it. So here's the new moon, or whiro, and on my māramataka, again, this is all personal, on my māramataka, this is the 1st day of the month, which was in Pākehā terms, the 25th of October. And I could have actually done this part a lot tidier. When I draw up my māramataka, which, oh God, it's gotten even more banged up on the bike ride here, but this is kind of the size of it, $5 magnet from Kmart that goes on the fridge. I start to write the moon day early, or if you can see here at the top of this box, and that indicates to me the moon's rising in the morning. I think it's somewhere 4:35 at the moment. It's rising very early. And then day to day, it starts rising a little later, a little later, a little later. Here we are today. Disclaimer, this period of the māramataka from Ariro through to Ohua is one of the parts of the māramataka I find varies the most from region to region, person to person. So please don't copy this and take this as gospel. This is my māramataka of things I've observed. So for me, huna rises today, as we saw, was at 3:20. And the moon continues to rise later, maybe 9 o'clock, the full moon at the moment, later still, until at this point next week, Takiro rises just before midnight, and there's no moonrise on the 12th. Oike rises in the morning. And this is so important because if you miss that little, I don't know what to call this, in Pākehā it might be, is it a leap day? I don't know. Because from a Mana Motuhake perspective, it's just one moon day to the next day. It's so important to have this day observed, or you can find yourself getting quickly out of whack. So from, again, my personal observation, particularly with the help of advice from navigators, some of their answer to me was, when that moon rises, that moon day begins. And so particularly around this time where the moon is rising in the middle of the day, it's quite important to know that you're transitioning halfway through the day into another moon. The last thing I'll say is personally, I find the power of these moons is particularly important just before they rise. And that would be the case for me for whiro, for Ōturu and Rākau Nui. You can sometimes feel that energy is starting to build before they rise. I'm happy to come back to this point and to speak in detail with anyone who wants to on this, but I'm not going to bore us all to tears and talk about each individual day and putting in extra days. You can come and be a real nerd with me on this anytime at another time. So now I want to talk a bit about, what does this mean living in a colonial state like Aotearoa, where the kāwanatanga has unfortunately a huge degree of influence over our relationship with the Taiao and with the practice of mātauranga Māori. I wanted to start with a quote from a Te Taitokero woman, Miri Ngāroto, Putia te rito o te harakeke, kaiwhia te kōmako e kō. Ki mai kia hau hi aha te mea nui o te ao, māku ki atu, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. So often this one is rolled around as, people are important. And then I hear, often my students will say, that can't be right. That's a Pākehā idea that people are superior or the most important thing. And my interpretation of this is to say the things that we do, the way that we behave, the actions that we can take, whether it's taking harakeke or any other type of activity, has great impact. And so we have to remember how important our actions and behavior is. And that's how I think about that. That's consistent with a mātauranga Māori worldview that talks about the interdependence between the well-being of us as people and the Taiao that we are a part of, not separate to, not in control of. And that's the knowledge system that's depicted here, that Tū Mātauranga is one of many siblings which all come from Ranginui and Papatuanuku and Io Matua Kore, and you can't pull us out. Our whakapapa can't be torn apart from the rest of the Taiao. So Western science is just starting to catch up to those thousands of years of enduring wisdom. And now starting to think about the relevance of this from a Te Wānanga o Raukawa perspective to te reo Māori, is this phenomenon of biocultural diversity. And so there's a map here that's showing these are the biodiversity hotspots and high biodiversity areas across the globe. And this is the distribution of the remaining Indigenous and non-migrant languages in 2009. I've referenced the research here. And so for some time now, both linguists and ecologists and conservationists have identified this global pattern that there is a relationship between places that have diverse language and culture and places that have good biodiversity, which basically means lots of species, habitat intact. I think the greatest example of this that's been shared with me is in Vanuatu, and you have people living valley to valley with distinct ecology in different valleys and distinct languages in each valley, such that people on one side of an island to another will have quite a distinctly different reo. And the way that we understand that, I think, as Māori, is that we talk about our role as tangata to enhance Māori, that, again, we're not separate from ecosystems. We as people, we develop biodiversity, we maintain it, we enhance it. And what flows from that is our reo, comes from the Taiao, cultural practices like mahinga kai. The depictions in our art form come from the Taiao. There are so many aspects of our reo and our culture that are directly informed by the biodiversity that we have here in Aotearoa. And so they are interdependent. And I would say that we should think about the types of linguistic and cultural relationships that globally we as Indigenous people hold with the environment are actually critical to the survival of that biodiversity. Because if we look in these areas where this isn't just saying it's not a special hotspot, it's saying there is not good biodiversity there. And so where that cultural relationship is lost, the value is lost, the value for water and land and everything that lives in the tile is lost, and humans start to destroy it. So whilst the tile gives us our reo and our language and our way of living, we could say that reo, mātauranga, tikanga is crucial to environmental well-being. It's critical to hold on to ensure its survival. And coming back to Mana Motuhake, I would say Mana Motuhake, it's an expression of the integrity of our relationship to place. So if we have integrity to where we are from, we're valuing it, we're observing it, we're in connection to it. And if we think about the problem on that big global scale, we can take it right down to us and that relationship. However, I wanted to think about the threats for us to this, and I did actually speak to this. It would be nearly a year ago now when we last had this lecture series. The Resource Management Act is currently being reformed by the Crown. They released an exposure draft, so their draft text on this, again, almost a year ago, and imminently a new version will be released. Sometime this month, the Crown is likely to introduce a new bill that they propose to replace the Resource Management Act, which is the key piece of environmental legislation in Aotearoa. And there are some horrific things in here that is so at odds with that thinking around the interdependence of the environment. One clue would be it's named the Natural and Built Environment Bill. It will be Act. So it poses this framing that we can somehow separate the natural world from the built world. And there's people in here I know that could tell you, okay, come down to the Waikanae River with how highly modified it is and all the rock walls and the groins. Now you tell me what part of that is nature and what part of that is built. And immediately you have a dilemma where it's actually an artificial distinction. That distinction is not clear, it doesn't exist. When this was first released, and it's not likely to be too different, I wouldn't say, when it's re-released shortly, in the purposes, this key concept of te oranga o te Taiao, which, and I'll read it out, te oranga o te Taiao to be upheld, including by protecting and enhancing the natural environment. And again, this emphasis on the natural environment. It further defines this concept of te oranga o te Taiao, that it incorporates the health of the natural environment. So what might that mean for us as kaitiaki? Also further in the text, you can see paradoxically, it recognizes the interconnectedness of all parts of the natural environment. Whereas we understand the interconnectedness within the whole environment across ecosystems, across society, across economies, and our cultural well-being. So the risk for us as kaitiaki is, whilst this might embed the ability to influence, if council says, what is it to uphold te oranga o te Taiao? That question is limited in how we can answer it, and that we're being asked to answer in terms of the natural environment. When we know that some of the most important things in upholding oranga are social things like providing for mahina kai, environmental education, food sovereignty, and economies that are self-sufficient. Actually, what resource management is about is managing us, managing the human aspects, not just focusing on so-called nature. I also just underlined in here, there is a focus on, whereas the RMA, the Resource Management Act, reference Māori, the relationship of Māori to their taonga. This new drafting focuses on iwi and hapū, and not at all, I'd be the last person to say we shouldn't ensure we recognise the rangatiratanga of iwi and hapū, but we've also potentially lost something if through resource management we can't simply protect the relationships that are at a lower or smaller scale, whānau land holdings, for example. So I'm very, very concerned about this legislation, and once it's introduced, what people like myself will be calling on an audience like this to do is to join us in making submissions, and just to think about what it might mean if whether you're a marae or hapū representative or iwi representative, if your engagement with local government, for example, or someone who wants a resource consent is limited to not really engaging on things like economies and urban planning, this has got really potential critical impact for us as kaitiaki. Coming back to the moon, the other big threat from kāwanatanga is the colonisation of the moon itself. And so this, of course, started as soon as these people could get to the moon. They are putting their flags up like colonisers have done all over Earth. And the symbology in this is very clear what that means. In 1967, nations around the world agreed to sign international legislation that said no one can colonize the moon, no one can say, I have sovereignty over the moon. However, in, I think it was 2020, NASA started the undertaking of, I don't know if you've picked up in the news at the moment, Artemis 1. And I want to acknowledge, and hate saying things that don't come from me, my friend Erin Carr, who woke me up to this and got me onto this kaupapa. Artemis 1, which is something that NASA is doing, which is really about demonstrating or testing if they have the technological capability to get a little bit of moon rock and material to bring back to Earth, which is part of a longer term idea to get people more permanently on the moon, to construct things on the moon. And the significance of what happened in 2020 is that NASA has successfully sold off the rights to, there's been contracts that companies now have that give them the right to mine the moon. So they will do that digging and get those moon rocks and bring them home. And a legal precedent has been set in that can give companies in the future the ability to mine the moon. This was embedded in what's called the Artemis Accord, which was signed last year in 2021 by, I think, 20 plus nations. New Zealand signed this last year because they want to have the ability to participate in this. And so I originally had a different article, but something came up this morning that they've announced they're ready to go November the 14th, which is next week. So next week, they'll attempt their first launch to start this project to mine the moon. There's obvious issues for us in terms of just colonizing a celestial body generally, but just thinking ahead in terms of the ability to actually mine a celestial body like the moon, and coming back to what we were thinking about in terms of how the moon and its gravity, its weight, affects so many things, I find it very risky to think about impacting the moon in this way and the flow-on effects. And it's kind of like something out of a sci-fi film. I feel it's like they might mine the moon, they might do something wrong that might affect its gravitational pull. What will happen with the tides? What will happen with tectonic plates? It's this foolish pursuit that I respectfully have to say is quite typical of Western science, to just prove what you can do. So what are our options here? So thinking now of our ahunga tikanga program and our very clever tikanga and legal minds that we have connected to us at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, one of the ways in which we can protect parts of the Taiao, like the moon, is through recognizing its personhood. So this comes really naturally to us as Indigenous people. I've brought Hine Kōrako, an image I have myself by Whaia Robin Kahukiwa. I could have just done a whole presentation on her artwork, but I don't have the legal right to do that. So that's another lecture for when I can ask her permission to do that. There's another image here of Hina Te Iwa, which is another personification of the moon. There are actually many different personifications, all a little similar, all across the Pacific. But this idea of personhood of parts of the environment is something that is being championed in Aotearoa. If we think about the Whanganui River and that having legal personhood, if we think about Te Urewera and that having legal personhood, there's the ability internationally to advocate for the personhood of the moon and her own right to exist, to be recognised. And that's one thing I think that we should think seriously about. So the last thought I wanted to leave us with around Mana Motuhake and the moon, and I don't know if that seems like not a very likely topic to think about the moon and Mana Motuhake, but I have a picture here of my son, Te Kanui, who seems to love pointing out particularly the tamatea phases of the moon, which he's doing here at Ōtaki Beach. And I would say, you know, if a child is on a journey to become a scientist, a kaitiaki, a rongoā practitioner, a healer, a doctor, an athlete, the moon is their companion in that journey. If a child is going to get into something like sociology, social work, psychology, mental health, the moon is their companion. If the child is going to be a hunter or gatherer, is going to work in economies of food, the moon is their companion. The moon's their companion in recognizing their own distinct, legitimate rhythm. It's their companion in reclaiming our subjective, place-based, kaupapa-based, constructed knowledge. And it's their companion in building a relationship of integrity with the Taiao. So I would really encourage you, even if it's to begin with, just that whiro, just that oturu o rākau nui, to observe, reconnect with your moon companion, and in doing so, through its reflection back to you, reconnect with yourself. Anō reira, tēnei te mihi nui mō tō tainga mai ki te rongo ki tēnei kōrero mō taku ngākau. O te rā, he mihi aroha, he mihi nui. Tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe Mahina-a-rangi. Always a pleasure to listen to your kōrero, and have to encourage you, and actually all of us, to keep nerding out, to keep delving into your mātauranga Māori knowledge interests and being a knowledge builder. It's actually a vital activity for the things that we do here at Te Wānanga Raukawa, and contributing to our mātauranga Māori continuum. So that's us, knowledge builders. We're moving into our wāpātai, our question and answer session. And so we're going to take a pātai from the floor and then one from online and alternate in that fashion until we run out of time. For the ones from the floor, please wait until, please signal to us, raise your hand, and one of us will bring the microphone to you. It's important. We want to have your pātai recorded, and for the online listeners to be able to hear you. And for the ones online, please post in the chat and we'll get your question answered if we can. So we're going to start with a pātai from the floor. Kia koutou. Ooh. Good save. He pātai a koutou. Any pātai from in the room? Don't be shy. Kia manuenu.
Kia ora, tēnā koe. I was wondering, when you're making your own personal maramataka, what are the types of things that you observe and record, like aside from the time it's rising or what you're seeing?
Good question. Just before answering that, I should say, whilst I'm obviously advocating to develop your own maramataka, you've got to start somewhere. So first off, I would just be using other maramataka and following that maramataka and then observing things. And I definitely don't want to make anyone think, oh, I just won't look at any other maramataka now. And I hope you hear what I'm saying, that it's a mixture of looking at others out there, talking to others, and then building your own. I don't want to give too roundabout an answer, but again, I would just observe the things that are important to you. And I think we again have been conditioned to think about knowledge in this really abstract way. So if we come across a maramataka that's about growing, we might be inclined to think we need to focus on observing the maramataka through the ngahere or through our mara. But we might not be mara people. We might actually have another interest. So for me, it's observing, as I said at the beginning, actually myself and how I feel over different days. I can work quite a lot at times. And so for me, it's really important to be able to anticipate periods where I need to be able to take a break. I very much utilize the moon to get work done. And if I'm able to time certain projects to complete, for me personally around Ōturu, then I have success with that. And so it's very, very personal. It can also help, and I don't know if my partner's listening, I know it won't make it too personal, but I think anyone can relate to the fact that if my mood changes throughout a month, it's really handy to be able to anticipate that. It's also helpful if you feel some type of way to know it might just be that that's this time. And I'm also thinking about the work done by Ricky Solomon around the incidence of whakamomori, suicide and self-harm around whiro and rākau nui, is to understand from a mental health perspective that periods of feeling very low, depressed, periods of feeling really anxious and like things are very intense, to a degree are natural, to a degree are patterns and rhythms, and that we shouldn't feel that we're weak if we feel that way. We should recognize and accept that these are natural rhythms that we're all subject to. So I don't know if that helps, or if there's a particular part of the taiao that you're looking to understand more. But yeah, and I'd also just say, you don't necessarily, or I don't write any of this down, because for me personally, other than writing the days down in a mātauranga, I don't write down my observations, because I find if they are relevant, they repeat in my mind month to month. I go, I've seen this, I've heard this, I've thought this before, and that sticks, and it becomes that internalized knowledge. Oh, you got an online partai?
Yes, we have an online partai from Āwhina Hirikiuha. During the time between moon setting and moon rising, therefore no marama in the sky, do you continue to observe the previous marama until the next rises?
Great question. Yes, I do. So if I understand that question correctly, when a moon rises, and again, just to make it a little complicated, just before it rises, I'm conscious it's about to rise, I feel that energy building, and it rises and it becomes, for example, today, huna. And then it will set. And then in the next day, which in my mātauranga is mawharu, it won't be mawharu until it's just about to rise. And if you want to really nerd out, I'm really interested in whether people think it's particularly strong during that time the moon is visible. I have a hypothesis that it is, but I've not tested that. So I would love to talk with others about that.
Okay. Do you have another partai from in the room? Right, kia ora, Lincoln.
Tēnā koe, Mahina-a-rangi. Just wanted to know, how did you become interested in the moon and Te Āti? Is it just your name?
Yeah.
What other factors?
How I became interested in the moon, I actually referenced them a couple of times now. So I think it's right to say, I think the Hawaiians influenced me to be interested in the moon, because Mahina in Te Reo is quite an old name for the moon, but in parts of the Pacific, it's the name for the moon. So they identified me with that straight away. And then, you know, mates that I got to know would always be like, oh, like, what about the moon today? Or like showing me the moon when it was really, so it kind of occurred to me, well, this is actually part of my identity. I know that sounds super obvious, but that's over the Pacific, there's wonderful, you find when you travel the Pacific, even though our knowledge has been attacked by the West, there's these wonderful pockets where little bits of it still exist very much intact, and mātauranga and taro is very much in that intact state in Hawaii. So they got me interested in it, and just over time that interest grew. I was probably more interested in the environment generally and Taiao conservation, actually as a result of Uncle John Barrett bringing me over to the island, be very lucky to catch kiwi for translocation at a young age. And so that just, having that connection to a taonga like kiwi, to look one of them in the eye and understand that relationship and how they see us and our role to protect them, that really, I think in education, you might call that an exposure moment. So there's another thread there of how this stuff is really important from an education perspective too.
Hi, another online one, and it's getting to 2 o'clock, so that might need to be the last one. This is from Pātaka Moore. Kia ora, Pātaka.
Might feel left out. Sorry, Pa.
Given that many Māori have given away the mātauranga for a wristwatch and a calendar, and therefore a lot of our knowledge has been lost, do you think our Pacific whanaunga, those from Hawaii and other islands, hold knowledge that could inform our reinvigoration of our māramataka Māori here in Aotearoa?
Ka pai. Great question. I've kind of alluded to part of that, but thank you, Pātaka. You're always picking up the last thing I forgot. That's reminded me I can't share this book. Don't have permission to, put information from it in slides, but this is a book from Hawaii that has a whole lot of mātauranga, and so it's got kōrero in there, seeing if the camera picks this up too, on different phases of the moon, in terms of tides, in terms of planting, in terms of people's personality and their birth. And just expanding on this point around the pockets of mātauranga a te moana nui ākiwa, Pacific knowledge that's been retained, in reclaiming our knowledge and then building it further, that those relationships with Pacific people, and anyone who has them, is lucky to have them, will know, they're so critical at pulling the pieces together, because basically my mate and I would just sit on the beach and look at the moon and swap stories about what is the meaning behind this one, what's the name in your language, and I would see something through their name that was slightly different but similar, and their knowledge about it, and think, that's what that's alluding to. Okay, and you can do that not just with māramataka, but any part of our mātauranga, particularly our pūrākau and whakapapa. We can kind of fill in the blanks together as Pacifica people, which is why those relationships are so important. So very long answer to say yes. I think exchange across the Pacific is a really, really powerful tool for us as tangata whenua.
Ka pai, we can sneak in one more question, I think. It's from Shah Moata Davis, and it is, what is your aspiration for whānau hapū iwi and the reclamation of māramataka moving forward?
Oh man, Shah's just trying to get me to shed a few tears and get emotional here. I go back to this image of my son, and I think it's just the confidence and self-assurance to know that my observation of my world is legitimate. And we can practice that with our children. We can, I might be oversimplifying again, but we can get them to observe the taiao and what they see, and we can affirm that, because that kawanatanga system out there is very powerful and effective at making us feel like our knowledge isn't up to scratch, isn't right. And we really need to be, I guess, growing tamariki that are strong and confident enough to say hei aha to that, and to have confidence in their own, not just their mind knowledge, but their puku and their ngākau, and the way that we integrate that knowledge. So that's my aspiration, whilst it's really personal. If we have whānau like that, and hapū like that, and iwi like that, we'll be doing really well, I think.
Tino pai. If you find you have you think of a question a bit later on, a good way to get that answered is to go to wānanga.com and enroll now. Heke kaitiakitanga pūtaiao, because Mahina-a-rangi is a pūkenga or a lecturer in the program, and you'll be able to get lots of time to ask those questions. Also, if you're here in the room, please come for a cuppa, and you please feel free to approach Mahina-a-rangi. She's given the thumbs up for that. And if you're online, you can email Khan or reply to the registration email, and we'll get a response out to you. So please thank me in joining Mahina-a-rangi for sharing her nerding out and wisdom with us today. Kioi, tēnā koutou, e whakarongo maina, e mātakitaki maina, hoki mai a tērā wiki. Thanks to everyone in attendance. Please come again next week, the 11th of November, 12 o'clock, to hear from Pounamu Skelton, co-chair of Te Waka Kai Order, And then the following week, 18th of November, for the last in the series, to hear from Professor Rangi Mātāmua. Add a reminder to your calendar, or even better, go to wānanga.com to register so we can send you information and keep you in touch over the coming weeks. Ka mutu tēnei wāhanga I konei. Please join us for kai in Te Kete Uru Uru Tau on the side of the whare. That's us.